Good day, everyone, and welcome to this presentation, which was given on the 17th of April 2024 to the 39th World Veterinary Association Congress in Cape Town, South Africa. My name is Romain Trousset, and I own and work for a pet food company called Amigo Pet Food, based in South Africa, and the topic of the day is about canine nutrition, a rigorous examination of the kibble versus raw food debate, and this is a review based on scientific analysis. First of all, I would like to disclose the following conflict of interest. Of course, I owned and manage a pet food company producing kibbles, and I'm going to present a review opposing kibbles and raw food. Therefore, this can be indeed perceived as a conflict of interest. However, I will let the audience judge of the objectivity of my presentation. To introduce the topic, I think it is important to ask ourselves what are the motivations to feed raw food diets from pet parents. If you look at this survey published in the Veterinary Nurse Journal in 2015, a lot of these have to do with emotions, desire to go back to nature. Fear of processed food, perceived control over ingredient quality, greater involvement with pets, because indeed if you cook for them, you spend more time attending to their needs, lack of trust, perception about the detrimental effect of cooking. My point is that we are talking about science, and we are going to talk about science and peer-reviewed references. However, food is an emotional topic, and it's very important when addressing this not to oppose scientific facts and science to pet parents' emotion, because usually it's a debate that has no end. However, the idea is to present the audience with hard evidence and let you judge for yourselves. My review, as I just mentioned, is based on science, a lot of peer-reviewed articles, but not only. It is important to understand the perceptions from the pet owner side and go beyond these emotions. Firstly, when we oppose kibbles to raw food, we have to define what we're talking about. So what are kibbles? They are commercial diets produced by specialized factories, and they are a mix of ingredients which are originally dried or dry, maintained or reduced to minimum particle size, and cooked through extrusion and afterwards dried. So this is the cooking process we often talk about, extrusion. And after that, kibbles can be coated or not with fats and other liquids, for instance, palatability enhancers. Eventually, it looks like the product that you see on the pictures. There are different types of kibbles. Bear with me, this is a marketing definition of the segmentation that we all see in the kibble markets. There is a wide range of offer. Product from standard, using cheaper ingredients, low specifications, still meeting the minimum requirements from the legal perspective. And as you consider the different segments to premium, super premium, and ultra premium, the quality of the ingredients increase, the specifications are higher and higher, the claims are also more and more technical, often functional claims. The quality of the packaging also increases, and the marketing around the brands is going up with the segmentation. My point here is that it is particularly difficult to compare or take into account kibble or kibbles as one type of food. Of course, there are commonalities in the process. However, in terms of specification, in terms of digestibility, etc., there's a lot of variation within what we're talking about today as kibble diets. Raw diets, on the other side of the spectrum, can be homemade and very often inspired by Dr. Billinghurst, Schulze, and Vollard in their books where they recommended recipes based on meat and meaty bones. Raw ingredients are the foundation of the diet, and animal-based ingredients. There's an important variety of ingredients which is recommended, and supplementation is also recommended very often. You probably heard about the prey model. It's something that these authors refer to directly or indirectly. Basically, the idea being that in the dog's bowl, it is important to rebuild in proportions what a wild animal would find into a prey. In other words, the proportions must mimic the ratios between bones, flesh, organs, etc. There's also commercially available raw foods. Usually they are frozen or cooked. They are formulated or not, and they still need to comply with the local legislation. There are minced up animal bones, fats, and soft tissues, and other ingredients can be added. Now that we know what we're dealing with, I think that we need to define a few essential concepts. Before going further, what is nutrition? As per the Encyclopedia Britannica, nutrition is the assimilation, and therefore it carries an idea of digestibility, by living organisms. It is therefore very important to define dogs as the species that we are talking about today, of food materials that enable them to grow, maintain themselves, and reproduce. And these last few words are a reference to requirements. The first question is my dog a wolf? The authors in reference put forward that domestication happened between 12,000 years and 20,000 years ago. And domestication is the adaptation of a wild species to a new ecological niche. And therefore, the idea of adaptation goes through genetic modification. Domestication, according to Boitani particularly, is imprinted and irreversible. It is a process that has geared up the ancestors of dogs today, to be adapted to the niche, which is nothing else than human settlement dumpsters to start with. Progressively, Janli and Axelsson have illustrated this. There has been a drift of the genetics between the ancestors of the dogs and today's dogs. And if you compare the genomes of modern wolves, which are cousins, not ancestors of the modern dogs. So if you compare those two cousin species genome, you find, like Lee and Axelsson did, that there are 36 areas of genomic differences. And this is very interesting. 19 of these differences in genes refer to brain functions, because indeed domestication has changed the dog's brain. And 10 of these differences are referring to digestive functions. Very interesting, to the metabolism of glucose. So other starch gets broken down, particularly the presence of multiple of the genes coding for amylase. Amylase is one of the enzymes involved in breaking down starch into glucose that can be absorbed. And some of these genetic differences also refer to glycemia, and the way dogs control their blood sugar level, but also to fat metabolism, because as you would know, once in the bloodstream, the excess of glucose can be turned into fat tissues. Another point of contention is often the question between dogs and wolves which one are omnivores, which ones are carnivores. It is important to mention that according to these authors and taxonomy, carnivora is an order and not a diet, not indicating what the members of the carnivore orders are consuming. For instance, Canidae, which is a family that belongs to the carnivora order, is made out of omnivores like dogs, jackals, coyotes, foxes, and wolves. In the carnivora order, you also find herbivores, full herbivores like pandas, for instance. So carnivora, the order, is very different to carnivores, which are meat eaters. Back to the genetic differences, Arendt and a team quantified the amylase activity between dogs, finding an average of 3.5, and wolves, showing that basically dogs have 4 times more amylase activity coming from pancreatic amylase than wolves, and therefore this gives them the ability to digest starch in a much more efficient way. What is also interesting is that there are differences between breeds of dogs. The definition of dogs, as I just presented it, is coming from the literature, the scientific literature data. However, the people who initiated the raw food movement, and particularly Dr. Billinghurst, in his book Give Your Dog a Bone in 1993, define dogs in a very different way. He says, quote unquote, they are carnivores, and it's very important to feed them a variety of animal parts. They are vegetarians, and they consume their prey's digestive tract and the content of the tracts. They are scavengers, they eat nutrients-rich feces of other animals, and they are hunters, which require a wide range of ingredients variety. So you can see that this is a little bit of a mixed bag. More than likely the definition of omnivores, to be honest. However, the vision of Dr. Billinghurst in terms of where dogs belong is typically that they are just a tame version of the wild counterpart and therefore should be fed the same. Already, there is 2 different paradigms. We haven't spoken about nutrition much. We are talking about how dogs as a species are apprehended, whether it's from the evolutionary perspective and how they evolved from the wild ancestors, and on one hand, and on the other hand, for raw food partisans, they are similar to wild animals, wild wolves, and should be fed accordingly. The typical way from a scientific perspective to take nutritional requirements into account and evaluate nutritional requirements into account is referred to by the NRC in the US, the AFCO in the US as well, the FEDIAF in the European Union, and of course there are other country standards. The approach is science-based, either factorial or empirical approaches to evaluate the needs in essential nutrients. Those essential nutrients, in terms of requirements per day, for example, are turned into formulation via the evaluation of raw material content of these nutrients. Those standards are challenged and updated through an iteration process, which is typical of the scientific world. So some authors regularly published in peer-reviewed journals their work about specific nutrient requirements, ways of evaluating those requirements, ways of including different aspects of energy expenditures, for instance, and eventually every couple of years those requirements are updated and made available. What is important to understand is this: the industry and particularly the kibble industry, the commercial pet food industry, participates and is heavily involved in establishing and maintaining these requirements. And this is very often something that triggers suspicion by the member of the public. How can an industry contribute in defining its own standards, in other words? On the raw food side, dog nutritional requirements are viewed from a completely different angle. The raw food approach is that requirements do not have to be met every day. Ingredients requirements equal nutritional requirements, and therefore, if dogs are supplied with diets that fit their needs in terms of nutrients, then their nutritional requirements are fulfilled. Different authors recommend different proportions of meat, bones, offal, and added vegetables or grain, which, as already mentioned, are referred as the prey model. These requirements are established based on wild animals' behavior observations. However, very often in these books, there is little or no reference cited. And for instance, if you dig into the topic, you will realize that wolf behaviors authors, when they describe the feeding behavior of wolves, specifically mention that wolves do not eat the stomach and digestive tract content of their prey, which is something that Dr. Billinghurst, for instance, puts forward systematically. In fact, they eat a lot of grass, and according to these authors, it is to get rid of the parasites that they get in from living in the wild and consuming raw product. Right into the topic now. I've chosen to have a specific approach for the lack of time, because this presentation is bound to be 45 minutes long. I could not systematically compare kibbles and raw food diets on the same criteria. So I've chosen to address first and foremost the beliefs or the feelings of the pet parents community and try to establish if these were myths or facts. Cooking. To start with, something that you hear very often in the raw food circles. Cooking pet food makes it lose all its nutritional value. What is the impact of the process on various aspects of pet food? This is what I'm going to try to answer with evidence. In this study, 4 types of nutrients were evaluated to assess the impact of processing and extrusion, particularly on these. Starch is a compound that you find almost exclusively in dry kibbles, is gelatinized by the cooking process, and digestibility is increased tremendously in this study from 46 to 73% digestibility. Therefore, cooking is quite positive in terms of impact on starch quality. Fats, on the other hand, are oxidized. They are hydrogenated by extrusion, and this is not very positive because it increases the risk of oxidation and it denatures some of these fatty acids. Typically in kibbles, there is very little fat inside the dry kibbles. As I mentioned before, fats are coated, applied after extrusion to the outside of the kibble for different reasons. The first reason being that this way oxidation is the stress of extrusion which creates oxidation is skipped, basically, and those fats are applied at much lower temperatures and therefore they do not face the same risk. The second reason is for palatability reasons. It is working better for dogs if the fat sits on the outside of the kibble. And the pet food industry has a very standard strategy on managing the risk of oxidation by adding antioxidants in the oil, in the dry mix, or both. And just a side note, this is also something that is frowned upon by the raw food community, as they see antioxidants as dangerous additives to be added to food. Protein is quite stable under extrusion. However, if you zoom into the quality of the protein and the amino acids, particularly some amino acids and typically lysine, often, and this is the case in this study as well, the availability of lysine under the form of reactive lysine is monitored, and it drops through the extrusion process. In other words, protein is preserved, however, sensitive amino acids can be damaged. The damage is occurring through something called the Maillard reaction, which is a browning reaction that occurs between protein and some carbohydrates in the diet under heat. And the fourth set of nutrients which was assessed in this study is anti-nutritional factors that you find in plants. Beans, particularly, leptins, trypsin inhibitors are destroyed when going through extrusion, so this is a positive impact. Comparing digestibility is quite tricky because of the nature of the diet. Basically, if you compare whole diet in terms of digestibility, and on one hand you've got raw food, and on the other hand you've got a formulated mix of plant-based ingredients, minerals, and animal origin ingredients, the variety of nutrients, particularly fiber and minerals, is adding to lower digestibility. Fibers are not digestible by dogs, very little. Minerals in supply are also lowering the digestibility. However, it is important to, when reading articles, to be fair and objective. I'm quoting here a study that was doing a review on raw meat-based diets in dogs and cat nutrition. And typically this article cites 4 different articles establishing or confirming or stating that for dogs and cats, raw meat-based diets are more digestible. But if you dig into those references and you read those articles, none of them was about dog nutrition. So there was no comparison of digestibility for dogs. And moreover, the comparison that were made by these 4 references were exclusively on wild cats fed in zoos, diets to compare kibbles against raw food. I think this is not a very objective way to look at digestibility for dogs, to compare how tigers basically and wild cats do on kibbles and on raw food in terms of digestibility. And it is very important to be critical when reading these reviews. This is a set of data that has been published dealing with digestibility of dry matter on the right hand side, and on top, dry matter, organic matter, crude protein, fat, and energy. So if you look at on the left here, extruded diet versus on the third column, raw diet, the digestibility of dry matter is very comparable. For some reason, on dry matter and organic matter digestibility, the authors did not perform statistical analysis. That's why you don't see the little letter here that shows that if it's significantly different or not. However, the averages are very close, both for dry matter and organic matter. On crude protein, it's a little bit tricky to look at apparent protein digestibility in dogs because of the microbiome coming from the large intestine, which recombines, uses the incoming undigested protein. And when talking about apparent digestibility, it is an important bias. Natural enzymes are something that is often mentioned by the raw food community, and the destruction of these enzymes through processing is a concern that is raised. This is a review presented now on the screen about natural enzymes in human nutrition, and basically the review concludes that there's no link between the lack of enzymes and disease processes. In other words, destruction or not does not necessarily have an impact on health. The role of these enzymes overall, and particularly the synergy with digestive enzymes, is unknown largely. And there's a question raised about these enzymes' activity after digestion. In other words, an exogenous enzyme coming from food gets absorbed by the dog or consumed by the dog, ends up in the stomach, in stomach acids, very low pH. The protein nature of those enzymes is challenged, and the tridimensional structure of these enzymes is challenged by the acids. And in the small intestine, those enzymes are digested just as proteins, broken down by the digestive enzymes present in the small intestine. This would affect tremendously the activity potential of these enzymes, and there's a big question mark on these. Vitamins. Also, the claim going around is that vitamins are destroyed by processing. Well, in fact, this is something that is very well documented in the data found on in the scientific community, peer-reviewed data. This was a table that was published by Dr. Coelho, listing on the left-hand side the typical forms and type of vitamins that you would or could use in kibbles. And in columns, the different columns is the processing temperatures. And the numbers that you see here are showing how these vitamins react to the process. So I've summed it up for you so that it becomes a bit more readable. Vitamin A at 115 degrees during extrusion. Vitamin A, 81% is retained. Vitamin D3, 91% is retained. Vitamin E, 91% is retained. So the retention rate for these three are quite high. Vitamin K and vitamin C, I listed them specifically because they are heat-sensitive vitamins. However, in kibbles, it is possible to use forms of these vitamins that are heat-resistant, and therefore you see the losses are contained. 61% of the vitamin K content is retained after extrusion, and 68% of vitamin C. So the strategy recommended and used in the kibble or pet food industry is that the amount of vitamins is retro-engineered or calculated to take into account the losses during extrusion, but also drying, also storage, and this is integrated into calculation. In other words, if you retain 80% of the vitamin E or 81% of the vitamin A, if you include about 20% more, the 20% that you will lose, they will give you 100% of your objective after extrusion. There is also a risk in raw food in the sense that slaughtering and preparing meat is a process. Often processed food against non-processed foods are opposed. However, raw does not mean unprocessed. Slaughtering of an animal is a process, and through an abattoir, it's not as simple as the cuts are being put into tubs that are available in a supermarket. There is freezing, there is drip loss, and packaging, etc. And lipid oxidation is a risk for meat and meat products, even at this stage. Refrigeration and frozen fresh meat are indeed susceptible to lipid oxidation. It's something very interesting. Why is oxidation such a problem? Because oxidation increases the risk of free radicals and therefore increase the risk of inflammation. Another big question when comparing raw food against commercial diets or kibbles is about microbiology. Is raw pet food safe? There is on this topic a huge body of articles, a huge body of science available. And of course, I could not present many of these articles here due to the lack of time. However, I've chosen to present data that is significant. This was done in 2022, comparing and assessing the hygiene quality of commercial raw pet food. You can see on this graph, we will only look at the right-hand side of the graph. The left-hand side has to be with aerobic colony count, which is not such a great indicator of food safety. Here we are talking about Enterobacteriaceae, content of 37 samples of raw meat-based diets which were analyzed. Out of these samples, if you look at the solid red line here at the bottom, it represents the European Community limit for Enterobacteriaceae in human food. Out of 37 samples, only one sample made it. All the others were above this limit. And the red dotted line here represents the European Community limit for Enterobacteriaceae in raw pet food. You can see that about 25% of these diets is qualifying for the legal standards in the EU, and 75% is above these standards. The question is often, is this safe for my dog? Yes or no? I think, of course, that dogs have a different ability to ours to handle bacterial loads and pathogenic bacteria, certainly. However, it is important to position this risk not only as a pet risk, but also as the pet is a member of the family. The question is, what is this risk for the other members of the family? If somebody is a healthy carrier of pathogenic bacteria, potentially he can contaminate other members of the family, and particularly infants and elderly people have challenged or compromised immunities, and they can be threatened by a healthy carrier of pathogenic bacteria. This article, based on the same principle than the previous one, analyzed samples of ingredients used in raw meat-based diets, and on the blue bars here, you can see, for instance, that the beef ingredients were 90+% positive to a log of 3 of Escherichia coli, which is a pathogenic bacteria, also an Enterobacteriaceae. So this confirms what's on the previous graph, but what is interesting here is the orange bars. The orange bars are showing, out of these samples, how many contained multi-drug resistant Enterobacteriaceae. And in total, the average was about 60% of all these samples contained bacteria, Enterobacteriaceae, which are pathogenic and dangerous, which are also resistant to antibiotics. In other words, in case of an infection triggered by these bacteria, these strains of bacteria, they would be a lot more difficult to address with the typical antibiotics that are available for human and veterinary medicine. The question here is about the risk for human health, and this is a bigger scope than the risk for pet health only. When it comes to parasites, there's also a lot of data available about parasites being found in raw meat, a variety of parasites and their resistance form, a variety of authors, and this is indeed a risk with uncooked meat. When it comes to raw diets, something that is also a question is the nutritional balance. In other words, how do raw diets meet the requirements that are set by the various legislations in different countries in the world? So, of course, when you ask this to the raw community, or when you present this to the raw community, remember the nutritional requirements are not apprehended at all the same way that the legislation in different countries do by the raw feeding community. So the mere question of comparing AFCO requirements here in this column with the values the averages that you can find in raw pet food, adult, home prepared, and commercial diets is not legitimate for the raw feeding circles. However, this is the object of this presentation. I'm just going to compare a few points that have been highlighted by those orange dots here. The fat percentage, for instance, AFCO recommends 5% minimum, and these diets were showing averages of 21 or 16% of fat respectively. Why is this so high? In fact, the AFCO requirements are quite low because the fat is not recognized as an essential nutrient as is, but some fatty acids are essential nutrients. So what AFCO does is it recalculates based on omega-3s and omega-6s daily requirements how much fat needs to be included in diet to meet those fatty acids requirements, and therefore those are quite low. Raw meat-based diets often contain a lot of fat, of course, but also a lot of protein, and you can see the same against the AFCO requirement for adults of 18%. The raw diets scored 33% and 26%, so a lot of protein in excess. What happens to these proteins? They are turned into glucose, actually into energy, by a pathway called neoglucogenesis. And this is a costly metabolic pathway from a nitrogen excretion perspective, but dogs are able to maintain their blood sugar level through this pathway. What gets a bit more interesting is, for instance, the calcium requirement. So AFCO recommends between 0.6 and 2.5% of calcium, and you can see here in this column those requirements were not met. So 0.47 is short of 0.6 indeed, but what is even more concerning is the variability of the calcium content. On the right hand side here, where my pointer is, 0.38 refers to the standard deviation of these samples. So there is a standard deviation that is almost as big as the average, meaning there's a lot of variability in calcium, in phosphorus, meeting below the requirements again, and in the calcium to phosphorus ratio. It is the same issue with both these macrominerals, and their ratio and their content is particularly important for dogs and puppies. Therefore, this is a major risk. If you add to this the variability and the low levels of vitamin D that were found in these diets. 332 international units per kilo, where the minimum is 500. This is very short of vitamin D. However, what is even more concerning is that the standard variation here is more than 100% of the average. The same authors performed the same analysis on trace minerals, potassium, sodium, copper, zinc were identified as issues in excess, very variable, or in short supply in raw meat-based diets. These authors plotted those essential nutrients, or those nutrients, protein, fat, calcium, phosphorus, zinc, and copper, against a dotted line, which represents 100% of the minimum requirement from AFCO. You can see the protein average sort of close to the 100%. However, the spread is quite important, from 50% of what is required to 200%. The fat, as I mentioned earlier, is largely in excess. However, keep in mind the AFCO minimum requirements on fats are very low. Calcium, the spread is really staggering, with anything from almost 0% of the requirements to 600%. Same applies to phosphorus, zinc, and copper. So really a lot of variability in raw diets. And this has a lot to do with the fact that ingredients are variable because they contain so much water. Remember, raw diets are anything between 70 and 80% water. And this creates a lot of variation in the nutritional content. In addition, if pet owners substitute one type of ingredient by another, it also increases the variability of the nutritional values of this diet, and those recipes tend to drift over time. The raw food community often refers to the health benefits observed on the dogs, and it's not about debating if these pet owners are telling the truth or not. Their observation is very interesting. It's about trying to find references and publications that are confirming from a peer-reviewed perspective, scientific perspective, those health benefits. It is quite difficult, to be honest. There's not a lot of publication on the subject. I will present two of them that I find interesting. This first one, 55 dogs were either fed kibbles or raw food for more than 2 years. And some health markers were used to compare the health status of these dogs to basically quantify the potential benefits. On the blood parameters, there was no difference observed, except on the lymphocyte count. So lymphocytes are cells coming from the immune system. And because raw meat-based diets are often more contaminated in bacteria, this tends to trigger the immunity of the dogs and an immune response. Some of these animals were actually shedding salmonella, interestingly enough, although they were all in good health. 55 dogs in the scientific literature is quite a significant number of dogs. Sometimes the studies are really on a few dogs here and there. This is a significant number, and that's why I selected this publication. There was no difference found in urine analysis, and they used another parameter which they called composite clinical health scores, which is basically a list of points that were monitored and observed by veterinarians, and those marks on these given points were compounded into one score, one index, which they call CSS. There was a slight improvement in the CSS criteria on the dogs being fed raw meat-based diets. However, the study also mentioned that the owner's management differed significantly between the two groups. And raw meat-based diets, and if you remember the first slide of the presentation, it was a criteria for feeding raw food is that owners want to be more involved with their dogs. So this article confirmed that raw meat-based diets feeders or pet parents are more likely to spend more time with their dog, be more active, take care of them in a better way, and use supplements. This study was done while the pets were at home and remaining at home, so the parameters were not 100% controlled. However, very little difference were observed. Another interesting article about early life programming by diet. So nutrition can switch on and off some genes and some conditions. And in this article, it was the risk of otitis in dogs later in their life, which was compared. So it was confirmed that raw diets decrease the risk of otitis later in their lives. Ultra-processed diets increase the risk. So it is important to note that these are the terms that were used in this study, and the authors did not make available in detail what was the raw diet made of, and what was the so-called ultra-processed diet made of. What was also interesting is that there is an effect of the mother's diets and the puppy's diets on the puppy's otitis. So it seems that what the mother is eating is also conditioning the health of the progeny. Sunlight was also a factor triggering more than 1 hour daily of sunlight exposure reduced the risk of otitis. And the reason why I mention this is because this is a study that exposes correlations between factors and the parameters that were measured. There's no theory or reasoning about why the ultra-processed diets increase the risk, and it is just statistical analysis. The authors also disclose a bias in their study, is that this is all based on owner's feedback. In other words, all these dogs that were studied, the data that were compiled is supplied by the owners only, and not by veterinarians or typical medical records. When it comes to grains, which are very often included in kibble diets, to the exception, I suppose, of grain-free diet. However, these are also using large amount of plant material, plant species or strains that do not belong to grains, such as potatoes, lentils, peas, etc. They potentially carry the same level of risk. However, the question is, are grains superheroes or villains? Are grains good or bad for dogs? We've seen earlier in this presentation that the genetic makeup of dogs, and particularly their ability to produce amylase in their pancreas, allows them to break down starch. However, there is no dietary requirement for carbohydrate. What it means is that carbohydrate is not considered as an essential nutrient, but there is a metabolic requirement for glucose. Glucose is a carbohydrate. So how does it work? Basically, the metabolism of dogs, particularly brain, muscles, and some specific organs, require glucose as an essential nutrient to operate and to function properly. Glucose is often called the sugar of life. It is an essential fuel for dogs, and if they do not acquire this glucose through the digestion of carbohydrate and starch particularly, dogs can turn protein into glucose. It's the gluconeogenesis which I mentioned earlier. This allows them to maintain their blood sugar levels even if they do not eat starch. However, this pathway is consuming protein, and it can lead into a protein deficiency because glucose is handled as a priority metabolism by the dog's body, and therefore when there's not enough protein for both pathways, the typical protein utilization and the energy requirements, it is the typical protein processes such as growth, tissue repair, and immune response, which is cut short in supply. Protein is a less efficient source of energy than carbohydrates, as I mentioned before. Also, the nitrogen wastage and the footprint of nitrogen is much higher when protein is used for energy. So the question is starch digested by dogs? We're not going to spend too much time on this. There's a lot of data available. You can just see here on the left-hand side, maize, sorghum, millet, and rice. 4 cereals that are rich in starch. The dry matter digestibility of these is excellent, around 90%, 86% for millet, and a bit more for the rest. And the starch digestibility of these is also very high. They could calculate an energy level for these ingredients, and this answers the question, and this is very consistent in terms of result throughout different publications in the literature. Is there a starch obesity? Sorry, is there a link between starch and obesity? In other words, is starch triggering obesity? A lot of authors are addressing these questions. They are in reference at the bottom of this slide. Starch is a primary driver to the glycemic response, meaning that when there's consumption of starch turned into glucose by the process of digestion, high blood sugar levels or high blood glucose levels are dealt with by dogs through the glycemic response. Glycemic response is basically shifting the metabolism of dogs so that organs and muscles are absorbing glucose to drop the level in the blood, but also in case of an excess, these glucose levels can be turned into fat tissue deposit. However, it is not different to any other nutrients that can be used as energy. What triggers obesity is not the presence of starch, is the presence of an excess of calories. And these excess of calories can becoming from starch. It can be coming from fat. Fat contributes to energy twice as much as starch. So what is risky here is not the presence of fat or the presence of starch. What is risky here is an excess of those nutrients that are bringing calories into the diet. And again, the main contributor to obesity is a positive energy balance, where basically the amount of energy absorbed by a dog on a daily basis, wherever it's coming from, fat, protein, or carbohydrates, is in excess compared to the dog's requirement on a daily basis. What else comes with grain? Because grain are being seen as the enemy by the raw food circles, and we've seen that they actually bring a fair amount of energy to the diet, so they contribute nicely to the energy level of the diet. What else can be so negative about grains, and whatever comes with grains? Overall, this is true for every ingredient when it comes to pet food. They are not purified ingredients only bringing one type of nutrient. They are a package of different nutrients in terms of macro nutrients, in terms of micronutrients, but potentially also in terms of contaminants. We're going to talk about mycotoxins, about crop treatment residues, fibers, phytonutrients, and resistant starch fractions. Mycotoxins, what are they and where do we find them? So they are ubiquitous in grains. They are contaminants. They are the product of mold. They are toxic metabolites that are present in very, very minute amounts. We're talking about milligrams in tons that can have a big impact on dogs' health. They are very stable. They survive most processing steps in the production line, including the extrusion and the heat treatment. And that's why we see those headlines, unfortunately, very often. This is from January 2021, recall of pet food flagged by the FDA after the death of 28 dogs. So this was related to high aflatoxin levels. Aflatoxin is a mycotoxin present in grains. Another example, 2021 in June this time, mycotoxin contaminated cat food ingredients that caused the death of more than 350 cats in the UK. So this is a very serious topic and serious risk, and it exclusively comes through grains. However, today, with the means of analysis and controls that are available to pet food manufacturers, it is possible to control this risk. Crop treatment residues, by definition, they are present in grains. I'm not an expert in the different crop treatments options. I've decided to present this survey, which deals with glyphosate, which is the herbicide the most used in the world. What you can see is that in soya beans, in the two sources, USDA and FDA, 90% of the samples were showing residues of glyphosate. 61% of the samples were showing residues of glyphosate here. And maize or corn, 58% of the samples were showing residues of glyphosate. So these are residues, they're not they're low levels. However, the impact of glyphosate on the gut microbiome and on the dogs themselves still needs to be investigated. Grains also bring phytonutrients to the picture, and these can have a very positive effect on health. Phenolic compounds like tannins, carotenoids like vitamin A precursors, vitamin E, oryzanols, dietary fibers, and beta-glucans all have very well-documented effects on health, and they positively impact the health of dogs, and they are exclusively present in grains. An interesting compound of grains as well is resistant starch. Resistant starch, just like fibers, escape digestion and therefore is available for the gut microbiome and becomes a substrate for the microflora. So a lot of these compounds, namely dietary fibers, beta-glucans, resistant starch, are what is called prebiotics. So they are food supplied to the gut microbiome of dogs and influencing positively the variety and the health of these microbes. In turn, the dogs benefit. There is also residues in raw meat product. This is a survey listing in different countries and different type of samples antibiotics that were detected: tetracycline, OTC, etc., etc. These are all antibiotics that are used both in animal farming and in human medicine. And maybe this is the reason why the strains of bacteria that come with the meat samples are resistant to these, because there are residues found in those meat samples very regularly, unfortunately. What is the effect on dental health? It's something that is claimed by both sides, actually. Kibble manufacturers are saying the abrasion effect of kibbles is positive, and raw meat-based diets partisans are saying that the abrasion effect of bones on the plaque is helping dogs with their dental health. This is confirmed by Watson's article, who studied diet and periodontal disease in dogs and cats, and he mentioned that soft diets are inefficient to clean teeth, but harder foods requiring prehension and mastication are preferable. So this can be, of course, kibbles. This can also be bones. There is controversy in the veterinarian community about the risk of feeding bones to dogs and how it can damage their gums and their teeth. However, kibbles, bones, and also chew toys have a positive effect on plaque. Interesting article published by the University of Pretoria by Steenkamp and his team. Wild dogs also have dental diseases, just like domestic dogs. And of course, they do not eat kibbles. They eat exclusively raw food, including bones. And they are showing those periodontitis signs without showing signs of dental tartar. Overall, there are studies of large wild cats that have also found that these cats suffer from the same issues. And the point of this presentation here, or this slide, is that these dental issues occur both in the wild and in domesticated animals. An aspect of the comparison that is not often tackled is the environmental impact of the diet of pets and dogs, particularly on the environment. So the data in this article is coming from ingredients. Basically, they evaluated the footprint of ingredients. Quite a number of diets were assessed, 938, for greenhouse gas emission, land use, acidifying emission, eutrophying emissions, which is nitrogen waste, freshwater withdrawals, and the stress on water use. On all these criteria, the impact of wet diets, raw food, is superior to the impact of dry diets. In other words, raw meat-based diets are a lot more impactful for the environment, and I've chosen to only present one criteria that a lot of people are familiar with. It's the CO2 equivalent footprint. Wet diets have a footprint when it comes to CO2 equivalent per year 8 times bigger than dry diets. So this is highly significant. What is important, though, to mention is that this study is not taking into account packaging, is not taking into account transport, storage. For instance, if raw food needs to be frozen, depending on the packaging that is used, etc., etc. This would vary a little bit. However, you can see that on the diet themselves, the difference is really massive, and this is very recent data from 2022. It's a topic that is becoming more and more important to the world, and I thought it would be interesting to mention it. What are the economics of raw food versus kibbles? Not a lot of peer-reviewed data available. Actually, I didn't find any. However, there's a lot of comparison that are possible to find done by blogs or private publications, and they're all concluding the same, more or less. So I've chosen this one from 2022. It's quite recent, and extrapolated yearly cost. So per year, to feed kibbles can cost between 5 times and 2 times less than feeding homemade, depending if you're on a homemade or a budget homemade diet. When it comes to commercial raw diets or wet diets, it costs about 8 times more to feed these diets compared to kibbles, and freeze-dried is about the same magnitude. So overall, feeding raw costs a lot more than feeding kibbles. And this was the last criteria of comparison. The conclusion is that raw food versus kibbles is an emotional debate, and the implications are also bigger than nutrition only. It's about human health, it's about pet health, it's about practicalities, and this is really what I wanted to put the emphasis on. There is a strong body of science to consider on a lot of the points that I mentioned, and science is progressing to understand these more and more. For instance, the environmental impact. It's not something that was available in the literature 20 years ago, certainly, but it's something that becomes more and more of a concern. Resistance to antibiotics of the bacteria that are found on raw food is something that becomes more and more of a modern concern. Overall, there is a need for education in the pet parents community. It is not easy when you think you're doing the right thing, when you're investing time in feeding diets that you cook yourself, that you prepare yourself to your pets, to be told that this is not good for reasons that you don't fully understand, whether it's microbiology, digestibility, balance, etc. It is important to assess this carefully. I would like to thank you for your attention and quote Mark Manson to close the day. Nobody's wrong 100% of the time. Always look for the nugget of truth in those you disagree with. Nobody's right 100% of the time. Always look for the faults and mistakes in those you agree with. Thank you very much.